When 78-year-old Norman Bixby blew his entire pension on renting Dracula's castle for a week, his friends called him senile, and his family stopped taking his calls. But Norman had a plan, one he didn't bother sharing. What started as a comical romp with plastic fangs, questionable capes, and an obsession with bats quickly turned into a jaw-dropping saga of self-discovery, redemption, and lessons that would change the lives of everyone involved. And no, Norman was not crazy. At least, not completely. Norman Bixby had never been the type of man to make headlines. A retired librarian with a slight stoop and an impressive collection of novelty bookmarks, his life had been defined by routine. Every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., Norman would shuffle into his kitchen, pour himself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and sit down to read the newspaper. That was until one fateful Thursday when he slapped the paper down, stood up, and announced to his cat, Wellington, "That's it, I'm renting Dracula's castle." It had started a week earlier when Norman had come across a peculiar article online while Googling "Best Places to See Bats in Europe." There it was, Dracula's castle in Transylvania, available for rent. The headline had glimmered at him like a beacon of opportunity, a sharp departure from his humdrum existence. For a man who had spent decades alphabetizing books and attending knitting club meetings with his late wife, the idea of renting an actual castle, Dracula's castle no less, felt deliciously absurd. Norman wasn't just intrigued, he was obsessed. The thought of walking through the same halls as Vlad the Impaler, possibly stumbling across a secret passage or two, filled him with a childlike giddiness he hadn't felt in years. He spent hours poring over pictures of the castle, imagining himself as a 78-year-old Count Dracula, complete with a velvet cape and plastic fangs. But reality hit when he called the booking agent. Renting the castle for a week would cost him nearly his entire pension for the year. A sensible man would have hung up, but Norman wasn't feeling particularly sensible. "You only live once," he muttered to himself, clicking the Confirm Booking button. The backlash was immediate. When he told his Thursday night poker buddies about his plan, they erupted in laughter so loud it nearly shook the table. "Norman, have you finally lost it?" barked Fred, his oldest friend. "What are you going to do? Host a vampire tea party?" His daughter, Elaine, was less amused. "Dad, this is crazy," she said over the phone. "You can't just throw away your pension on some gothic midlife crisis." Norman's response was simple. "Elaine, I'm old. If I don't do it now, I never will." It was an argument she couldn't counter, though she spent the next 10 minutes trying. Finally, she gave up, muttering something about his stubbornness being hereditary. Norman took that as a victory. Wellington, the cat, seemed indifferent. He watched Norman pack with the same disdain he displayed for everything that wasn't tuna. Into the suitcase went a pair of hiking boots, a thick sweater, and a box of plastic vampire teeth. Norman wasn't sure what one wore to Dracula's castle, but he figured a mix of practicality and flair would do the trick. The flight to Romania was uneventful, save for the moment when the customs officer raised an eyebrow at the bag of garlic bulbs in Norman's carry-on. "For cooking," Norman said with a sly smile, though he had no intention of setting foot near a stove. As the taxi climbed the winding road to Bran Castle, Norman felt a thrill unlike anything he'd experienced before. The castle loomed ahead, its spires piercing the sky like jagged teeth. It was everything he had hoped for, and more. The driver, a burly man named Marius, seemed unimpressed. "Tourists always think castle is haunted," he grunted. "It's just old building." Norman grinned. "Maybe so, but old buildings have stories, and I'm here to find them." When they arrived, Norman stepped out onto the cobblestone path leading to the entrance. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. A chill ran down his spine, though he dismissed it as the excitement of the moment. The castle's caretaker, a man named Vladislav, greeted him at the door. Dressed in a long black coat with a high collar, Vladislav looked like he had stepped straight out of a Hammer horror film. His accent was thick, his tone dramatic. "Welcome to Bran Castle, Mr. Bixby," he intoned, bowing slightly. "We hope your stay will be unforgettable." Norman chuckled. "I hope so, too. Now, where do I sign?" The first evening was everything Norman had imagined. He roamed the castle's halls, marveling at the centuries-old architecture and the eerie flicker of candlelight on stone walls. He even tried out the coffin-shaped bed in his suite, though he quickly decided it was more for show than comfort. But as he sat in the grand dining hall, eating a surprisingly delicious bowl of goulash, Norman couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. Had he really spent his entire pension on a week of playing pretend? Was this all just an elaborate joke at his own expense? Then he remembered the look on Fred's face, the incredulity in Elaine's voice, and the weight of all those years spent wishing he'd done something outrageous. He raised his glass of wine to the empty room and said aloud, "To new adventures." Little did he know, the adventure was only just beginning. Norman Bixby woke the next morning to the sound of bats. At least, he thought they were bats. The faint fluttering noises echoed through the thick stone walls of his suite, and for a moment he wondered if he had somehow stumbled into the set of a horror movie. "Well," he muttered, rubbing his eyes, "this is what I signed up for." His first full day in Dracula's castle began with a breakfast served by Vladislav, who seemed determined to remain in character at all costs. "Good morning, Mr. Bixby," Vladislav intoned, his voice dripping with theatrical menace. "Did you sleep well?" "Like the dead," Norman quipped, grinning. Vladislav did not crack a smile. The breakfast itself was a feast fit for royalty. Freshly baked bread, local cheeses, and a strange dark sausage that Norman was certain he didn't want to know the origins of. As he ate, he couldn't help but notice the way Vladislav hovered, his piercing eyes watching every bite. "You know," Norman said between mouthfuls, "you don't have to stay in character all the time. I won't tell anyone." Vladislav merely inclined his head. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Bixby. This is who I am." "Sure it is," Norman muttered, hiding a smile. After breakfast, Norman decided to explore the castle in earnest. Armed with a flashlight and a map provided by Vladislav, he ventured into the castle's lower levels. The map was comically unhelpful, featuring vague labels like the Great Hall of Shadows and the Forgotten Corridor. It didn't take long for Norman to get hopelessly lost. As he wandered through the dimly lit passages, he began to notice odd details. There were scratch marks on some of the doors, as though someone, or something, had tried to claw their way in. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to follow him. Norman told himself it was just the wind, though he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was being watched. Eventually, he stumbled upon a room that wasn't marked on the map. The door was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the better of him. Inside, he found what appeared to be a storage room filled with old props, fake cobwebs, rubber bats, and even a coffin-shaped cooler stocked with sodas. Norman let out a bark of laughter. "So much for authenticity," he said aloud. As he turned to leave, he nearly collided with Vladislav, who had appeared in the doorway like a specter. "Ah, you've found our maintenance room," Vladislav said, his tone neutral. "We use it to enhance the experience for our guests." Norman raised an eyebrow. "So, the bats are fake?" "Some of them," Vladislav admitted. "Others are quite real." "And the whispers?" "The castle is old, Mr. Bixby. It has its quirks." Norman decided not to press further. He wasn't here to ruin the magic, after all. Still, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. He had come here seeking an adventure, not a carefully staged tourist attraction. "Well, I suppose every legend has a bit of theater behind it," he said, shrugging. The rest of the day passed in a blur of exploration and mild mishaps. Norman managed to trip over a loose stone in the courtyard, accidentally set off a hidden fog machine in the Great Hall, and startle himself by mistaking his own reflection for a ghost. By the time dinner rolled around, he was thoroughly exhausted. Dinner was another elaborate affair, this time featuring a roast that Norman couldn't quite identify. He decided not to ask. Vladislav was, as always, the perfect host, though his insistence on referring to the meal as the Feast of the Damned made Norman chuckle. As the evening wore on, Norman found himself growing increasingly curious about Vladislav. The man seemed entirely devoted to his role as the castle's caretaker, yet there was something about him that felt off. It wasn't just the theatricality, it was the way he seemed to know exactly where Norman was at all times, appearing out of nowhere with uncanny precision. "Tell me something, Vladislav," Norman said as they sat in the dimly lit dining hall. "Do you ever get tired of all this? The costumes, the dramatics, the fake bats?" Vladislav tilted his head, considering the question. "This castle has been my life for many years, Mr. Bixby. It is not just a job, it is a calling." "A calling? Huh," Norman said, leaning back in his chair. "I suppose there are worse places to spend your days." "And what of you, Mr. Bixby?" Vladislav asked, his eyes narrowing. "Why have you come here?" Norman hesitated. He hadn't really thought about how to answer that question. "I guess I just wanted to do something different," he said finally. "Something memorable." Vladislav nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Then I hope you find what you are looking for." That night, as Norman lay in his coffin-shaped bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Vladislav's words. What was he looking for? Adventure? Validation? A break from the monotony of his life? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he felt alive. As he drifted off to sleep, the sound of fluttering wings echoed through the room once more. This time, Norman didn't mind. After all, this was exactly what he had signed up for. Little did he know, the castle still had plenty of surprises in store. Norman Bixby's second day in Dracula's castle began with a strange discovery. As he wandered the corridors after breakfast, he noticed a faint trail of dirt leading down a narrow staircase. The dirt wasn't unusual. Centuries-old castles weren't known for cleanliness, but the pattern seemed deliberate, as if someone had dragged a bag of soil down the hall. "Maybe Vladislav needs a better cleaning crew," Norman muttered, though curiosity pushed him to follow the trail. The staircase led to the castle's catacombs, a labyrinth of stone tunnels dimly lit by flickering lanterns. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew. Norman hesitated at the entrance. Part of him felt he should turn back, but the sense of adventure that had brought him here won out. He took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The catacombs were eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Norman couldn't help but feel like he was walking into a scene straight out of a Gothic novel. "At least there's no ominous organ music," he joked, though his voice did little to dispel the unease creeping over him. Deeper into the tunnels, Norman stumbled upon something unexpected. A room filled with old wooden crates, each stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize. The crates were stacked haphazardly, some broken open to reveal their contents. More of that strange dirt he had seen upstairs. "What on earth?" Norman murmured, crouching down to inspect the soil. It wasn't just any dirt, it was darker, richer, almost unnatural in appearance. Before he could investigate further, a voice echoed through the tunnels, making him jump. "Mr. Bixby, you should not be here." Norman turned to see Vladislav standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You have a habit of sneaking up on people," Norman said, clutching his chest. "You're going to give me a heart attack one of these days." "My apologies," Vladislav replied, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. "These catacombs are not safe for guests. Allow me to escort you back upstairs." Norman frowned, glancing back at the mysterious crates. "What's with the dirt? Is this some kind of performance art?" "It is nothing of concern," Vladislav said quickly. "Now, if you please." Reluctantly, Norman allowed himself to be led back to the main part of the castle. But as they climbed the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that Vladislav was hiding something. The caretaker's usual air of theatricality had been replaced by genuine tension, and Norman's curiosity was piqued. "You're not going to tell me what that was all about, are you?" he asked. "It is better if some questions remain unanswered," Vladislav replied cryptically. Norman spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the encounter in the catacombs, but the image of those crates, and the peculiar dirt inside them, kept creeping back into his mind. He busied himself with exploring other parts of the castle, even venturing into the surrounding forest for a hike. The crisp air and breathtaking views did wonders for his mood, though they couldn't banish the questions swirling in his head. By evening, Norman was determined to get some answers. Over dinner, a hearty stew served in the grand dining hall, he decided to broach the subject with Vladislav. "So," he began casually, "those crates in the catacombs, they're not just for decoration, are they?" Vladislav, in the middle of pouring wine, froze for a split second before resuming. "As I said before, Mr. Bixby, they are nothing of concern." "Come on," Norman pressed. "You can't expect me to believe that. I'm not just some gullible tourist, you know." Vladislav sighed, setting down the wine bottle. For the first time, he looked genuinely weary. "The crates are part of the castle's history," he said carefully. "They are relics from a time long past." "Relics, huh?" Norman said, raising an eyebrow. "And the dirt?" "The soil is symbolic," Vladislav replied. "It is said to have been brought from the homeland of the castle's original master." "Dracula?" Norman asked, unable to hide his excitement. Vladislav hesitated. "The man we know as Dracula is a figure of legend, Mr. Bixby. But like all legends, there is some truth at its core." Norman leaned forward, his curiosity now fully engaged. "So, you're saying there was a real Dracula? A real vampire?" "I am saying," Vladislav said slowly, "that the past is not always as distant as we believe it to be." The cryptic response only fueled Norman's intrigue, and he spent the rest of the evening peppering Vladislav with questions. The caretaker remained tight-lipped, offering only vague hints and half-answers that left Norman more curious than ever. That night, as he lay in bed, Norman couldn't help but feel like he was on the brink of uncovering something extraordinary. The castle, with all its quirks and mysteries, seemed to hold secrets far deeper than he had anticipated. "What have I gotten myself into?" he murmured, staring up at the ornate ceiling. As sleep overtook him, the sound of fluttering wings returned, louder this time, as if the bats, or whatever they were, had drawn closer. For the first time since arriving at Dracula's castle, Norman felt a flicker of unease, but instead of fear, it was excitement that raced through his veins. After all, wasn't this exactly the kind of adventure he had been searching for? Little did he know, the adventure was only just beginning. Norman Bixby awoke on the third morning of his castle stay with a new sense of determination. The events in the catacombs and Vladislav's cryptic answers had stirred something deep within him. Curiosity, yes, but also a sense of purpose. "If there's a secret to be uncovered in this castle," he told himself, "I'm the man to find it." The day began uneventfully enough. After a breakfast of eggs and dark rye bread, Norman decided to retrace his steps to the catacombs. This time he moved quietly, keeping an eye out for Vladislav. With his flashlight in hand, he descended the staircase once again, following the faint trail of dirt. When he reached the room with the crates, Norman paused. He examined the symbols on the crates more closely, jotting down their patterns in a small notebook. The dirt drew his attention as well. It wasn't just darker than ordinary soil. It shimmered faintly, as if infused with unknown energy. "This is no ordinary dirt," he muttered, carefully scooping a small amount into an empty film canister. As Norman turned to leave, he noticed something new. a narrow passageway behind the stack of crates. The opening was small, barely large enough for him to squeeze through, but the faint flicker of light from the other side drew him in. "Here we go," he whispered, crouching down and making his way through the gap. The passage led to a hidden chamber unlike anything Norman had ever seen. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries depicting battle and ritual. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, upon which rested an ornate blood-red chalice. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and Norman shivered. "What is this place?" he murmured, stepping closer. He reached out to touch the chalice but stopped short when he heard a sound behind him. A soft shuffle, like footsteps on stone. "I warned you not to come back here," Vladislav's voice said, low and stern. Norman spun around to find the caretaker standing in the doorway. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," Norman said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "What's going on in this castle? And don't give me any of that 'it's part of the experience' nonsense." Vladislav sighed, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked less like a menacing figure and more like a weary man carrying a burden. "You have stumbled upon something never meant to be found," he said. "This castle holds more than just history, Mr. Bixby. It holds secrets that should remain buried." Norman crossed his arms. "I didn't come all this way to be kept in the dark. If you won't tell me the truth, I'll find it out myself." Vladislav hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but know this, the truth is not without consequence." He gestured for Norman to follow him, leading him back through the catacombs to a spiral staircase in a tower Norman hadn't explored. The room they entered was filled with old books and manuscripts, their pages yellowed with age. Vladislav selected a particularly worn tome and placed it on a wooden table. "This," he said, opening the book to a page filled with symbols and illustrations, "is the story of the castle's true master." Norman leaned in, his eyes scanning the text. Though the language was unfamiliar, the illustrations were clear enough. A man, dressed in armor, standing atop a pile of bodies. A ritual involving the chalice he'd just seen. And finally, a depiction of bats swarming around a dark figure. "The man you call Dracula was not a mere legend," Vladislav said. "He was real, but he was not the vampire of stories. He was something far older, far more dangerous." Norman's heart pounded. "So, what happened to him? Is he still here?" "No," Vladislav said firmly. "He was defeated long ago. His essence sealed away. The chalice you saw is part of the seal. It must never be disturbed." "Then why keep it here?" Norman asked. "Why not destroy it?" "Because some things cannot be destroyed," Vladislav replied, "only contained." The weight of Vladislav's words hung in the air as Norman processed what he'd just learned. He'd come here seeking adventure, but he'd found something far greater and far more dangerous. Yet, instead of fear, he felt responsibility. This wasn't just a vacation anymore. It was a mission. "I won't disturb anything," Norman said, "but I want to help. Whatever this castle is hiding, I'm not going to let it fall into the wrong hands." Vladislav regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but understand this, Mr. Bixby. From this moment on, you are no longer just a guest. You are a guardian." Norman didn't fully understand what that meant, but he nodded anyway. "Guardian, huh? Well, I've always liked a good challenge." That night, as Norman lay in bed, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. The castle's secrets were far greater than he'd imagined, and his life would never be the same. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Little did he know, his role as guardian would be tested sooner than he expected. The next morning, Norman Bixby awoke to an unsettling silence. Gone were the distant flutter of wings and eerie creaks of the castle. Instead, the air felt unnaturally still, as if the castle itself were holding its breath. Norman, now self-proclaimed guardian, had no intention of letting the quiet deter him. He threw on his hiking boots, grabbed his notebook, and ventured out, determined to piece together the castle's mysteries. He began his day in the library, poring over old manuscripts Vladislav had shown him the night before. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams that hinted at ancient rituals and protective spells. Each line seemed to carry a weight of importance, yet Norman struggled to decipher the meanings. "This chalice isn't just some trinket," he muttered. "It's the key to something much bigger." Just as he was jotting down a note, a loud bang echoed through the castle. Norman's head snapped up, his heart pounding. The sound came from the great hall. Grabbing his flashlight, he hurried down the stone corridors. The air grew colder as he approached, and a strange hum vibrated through the walls. When he entered the hall, he froze. The chalice, the one Vladislav had explicitly warned him never to touch, was gone. In its place was a scorch mark on the pedestal, as if the object had been ripped away with great force. Norman's mind raced. Who could have taken it? And how had they bypassed Vladislav? Before he could investigate further, Vladislav appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "It's gone, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Norman nodded. "I thought you were supposed to be guarding it." Vladislav closed his eyes. "I am not the only one who knows this castle's secrets." Norman frowned. "Then who else does?" Before Vladislav could respond, a low growl echoed through the hall. Both men turned toward the sound, their eyes widening as a shadow emerged from the far corner. It moved with purpose, coalescing into the form of a tall, cloaked figure. Its eyes glowed a deep crimson, and its presence radiated malevolence. "You should not have interfered," the figure hissed, its voice like nails on stone. Norman stepped forward, his knees trembling. "If you're looking for the chalice, you're out of luck. It's gone." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down Norman's spine. The chalice was only the beginning. Its removal has broken the seal. Soon, the master will rise. Vladislav lunged at the figure, his movement surprisingly swift. But the shadowy figure raised a hand, and Vladislav was thrown backward by an invisible force. Norman ran to his side, helping him up. "We have to stop this," Vladislav said urgently. "The seal must be restored before it's too late." "How?" Norman asked, glancing nervously at the figure advancing toward them. Vladislav grabbed Norman's arm, pulling him toward a side passage. "There's another way to contain the essence, but it will require both of us, and great sacrifice." Norman didn't argue. Together they raced through the corridors, the shadowy figure in pursuit. The air grew colder with every step, and a distant hum seemed to grow louder. Finally, they reached a small chamber deep within the castle. At its center was a circle of runes etched into the stone floor, glowing faintly. "This is the containment circle," Vladislav explained. "It can trap the master's essence once more, but only if we act quickly." Norman nodded. "What do I need to do?" "Stand in the circle with me," Vladislav said. "When the essence arrives, the circle will draw it in. But we must not step outside, no matter what happens." Norman swallowed hard but stepped into the circle without hesitation. As soon as he did, the runes flared to life, their glow intensifying. The shadowy figure burst into the chamber, its crimson eyes narrowing as it saw the two men in the circle. "You cannot stop what has begun," it snarled, its form writhing as it lunged toward them. The runes emitted a blinding light, and a powerful force pulled at Norman from all directions. He clenched his fists, his teeth gritted against the sensation. The shadowy figure screamed, its form unraveling as it was drawn into the circle. The room shook violently, and Norman felt as though he were being torn apart. Finally, the light subsided, and the room fell silent. Norman collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Vladislav stood beside him, pale but resolute. "It is done," Vladislav said softly. The master's essence is contained once more." Norman looked up, his eyes wide. That was intense. Vladislav allowed himself a small smile. "You did well, Mr. Bixby." Norman chuckled weakly. "Being a guardian isn't as glamorous as I thought." As they returned to the main part of the castle, Norman felt pride mixed with exhaustion. He had faced darkness and survived. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The castle still held secrets, secrets that would test him again. For now, though, he was content to rest. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Norman Bixby awoke on his final day in Dracula's castle with a strange mix of relief and sadness. The castle, with its secrets and challenges, had become more than just a curiosity. It had become a second home, a place where he'd found a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. But as the morning light filtered through the ancient windows, Norman knew his time as a guest and a guardian was coming to an end. Breakfast in the grand dining hall was quiet. Vladislav, as always, remained composed, but there was a faint warmth in his usually stoic demeanor. "You have done well, Mr. Bixby," he said, placing tea before him. "Far better than I anticipated." Norman chuckled. "Don't set the bar too low. I'm not as fragile as I look." Vladislav inclined his head. "Indeed, you have proven age is no barrier to courage." After breakfast, Norman wandered through the castle one last time. The great hall, the library, even the catacombs, all of them now held memories, moments of fear and triumph that Norman knew he'd carry forever. In the hidden chamber where the chalice had rested, Norman paused. The pedestal was empty once more, the runes faintly glowing as if to remind him of the battle fought and won. He placed a hand on the stone, a quiet promise to protect the castle's secrets. As he turned to leave, Vladislav appeared at the entrance holding a small, leather-bound book. "For you," the caretaker said, extending it, "a record of the castle's history, and a reminder of your role." Norman took it, tracing the intricate patterns on its cover. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Vladislav replied. "Simply remember." The afternoon passed in quiet reflection. Norman packed, occasionally glancing at the book Vladislav had given him. Its weight felt more symbolic than physical, a responsibility he wasn't sure he deserved but was willing to accept. Each time he touched its cover, he felt the enormity of his role settling in. A guardian wasn't just a title. It was a legacy. By evening, his taxi had arrived. Norman stood at the castle's massive entrance, his suitcase at his side. Vladislav stood beside him, his usual air of detachment softened by the faintest trace of emotion. "Will I see you again?" Norman asked, hope in his voice. Vladislav hesitated, then nodded. "Perhaps. Guardians are never far from the places they protect." Norman smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." The drive down the winding road was quiet, the landscape bathed in golden sunset hues. Norman glanced back at the castle, its silhouette stark against the vibrant sky. It looked peaceful, almost serene, as if the chaos of the past days had never happened. When Norman returned home, his cozy apartment felt almost foreign. The familiar creak of the floorboards and the soft meow of Wellington, his cat, brought comfort, but also a sense of disconnection. The world he'd left behind felt smaller now, its problems trivial in comparison. Over the next days, Norman tried settling back into routine. He visited the local library, played cards with his friends, and even attempted to explain his castle experience. No one believed him. Fred, his oldest friend, laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Dracula's castle, secret guardians, glowing runes. Norman, write a book. Norman smiled but said nothing. Some truths were better left unspoken. One evening, sitting in his favorite armchair with Wellington curled in his lap, Norman opened the leather-bound book. Its pages detailed the castle's history, its guardians, and their challenges. Among them, he found a new entry. His name, written in elegant script, with a summary of his role in restoring the seal. For the first time in years, Norman felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had become part of something greater than himself, a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. The elegant script described him not as a tourist but as a protector, someone who had stood against darkness and prevailed. Weeks turned into months, and life regained its rhythm. But sometimes Norman caught glimpses, a shadow moving where there shouldn't be one, faint fluttering wings in the distance, and he would smile. The castle's secrets might have been contained, but they were never truly gone. He understood that now. One crisp autumn evening, sitting on his balcony, Norman watched the sun dip below the horizon. A familiar presence stirred. He turned to see a tall figure in the shadows, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured but his stance unmistakable. "Vladislav." The caretaker inclined his head, a silent acknowledgment before disappearing into the night. Norman didn't follow. He didn't need to. The castle might be miles away, but its presence stayed with him, a constant reminder of the extraordinary adventure that had changed his life. With a contented sigh, Norman leaned back, his gaze fixed on the stars. For the first time in decades, he felt truly at peace. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready for whatever came next. After all, he was a guardian now,